Assassin's Promise, Chapter 122, by Thomas Woodward. Yassim Del crept along, careful not to expose himself to scouts. He had been traveling for the better part of a day and was weary. His dirty rags clung to him now, torn and tattered from where he had been beaten by his master. He had stolen snatches of food and had drunk water from a horse trough before anyone could stop him as he left the little village. He had so little time. He must make the best of it. Jagged rocks had cut him where he had been careless in his mad trek southward, towards the hidden encampment. He had remembered the narrow passages of a rocky canyon several miles before reaching his destination. He had seen the remnants of a great battle there. There had been attempts to hide evidence of a struggle, but he had seen the small telltale markings, skidded tracks in the sand, and broken foliage, however meager. Only the most stubborn plants could grow in a place like that. The sun withered most life with its baleful eye. The heat pounded against him like a forge fire from above. He had been made to gamble. He would need to steal or kill for the means for a return trip. But he had been given no choice. He would do whatever was necessary. His scarred hands hurt as he pressed them against the bright red rock that he had used for cover. If he remembered right, there would be an open expanse separating the merchant encampment, a perfect killing field. After escaping Rasham's wrath, he would not be so lucky a second time unless he was extremely careful. He could not count on slipping through the entrance. He hated it, but his only option would be to wait for nightfall. An arrow would take him as sure as his next breath, if he was foolish enough to try his luck again. He scuttled near the broken rock shelf, looking to find shade. Without it, he would never make it until nightfall. He searched on bleeding hands, ripped and torn from pressing them against the sharp rocks. Only a small part of Yassim could feel it. He hadn't slept in more than a day. After almost an hour of searching, he found a shallow crevice with a blessed pocket of shade. Dropping himself down a couple feet, he could feel the temperature drop another 10 to 15 degrees. Drinking as much water as he dared, he lay back against a rock wall. Sleep lay beckoning to him just beyond his eyelids. Yassim saw a woman, draped in gold. Her hair shimmered metallically, and she had deep green eyes. She called to him. He tried to reach out, but some pressure held him back, unable to touch her porcelain face. Why couldn't she hear him? But she could not. The woman wavered in front of him like a mirage. She cupped her hands together as if to speak something, but he could hear no sound, only a rushing of air in his ears. Desperate, Yassim tried to worm closer to the blinding figure, but a great weight pressed against him still. Slowly, droplets of water began to fall from the sky, building to a downpour that encased his legs and ran down his neck. It felt unreal. The water gathered in rivulets, collecting and rising. As Yassim looked down, he saw the water had risen to his chest. There lay a giant metal shield that was pressed against his chest, keeping him immobile. The water slowly continued its ascent, covering the shield so that only an opaque image of it reflected dully under the water's surface. The weight was incredible. It seemed to be increasing even as he struggled against it. As the waves rose to his chin, he looked up and recognized the woman, her face sharpening to his view. His wife, Mira! He tried to scream her name, but no words came out, for the water had immediately begun to fill his lungs. A wave of terror hit him, and the dream dissolved in front of his eyes. The last image he saw was recognition in Mira's eyes. Struggling to breathe, Yassim Del opened his eyes to see an enormous snake had wrapped itself around his torso. Its head was oddly shaped, diamond-like patterns crisscrossed its mottled skin. As it sensed his movement, its mouth gaped open, revealing long fangs that glistened wetly. He tried to breathe, but it was crushing him, preventing him from taking more than a shallow breath. Desperate, he scrabbled for his long knife that he had tied at his waist. The bulge of the snake's body was too thickly corded around him to reach it, so he tried to stand. He failed. The weight was immense. His mind started going fuzzy with lack of oxygen. All he could do was rock his weight back and forth slightly. As he did so, the snapping jaws came within inches of his face. He moved at the last moment, dodging the deadly maw just barely. In a desperate gambit, he pressed with all of his might forward and used the momentum to rock backwards before the snake could fully adjust to his feeble attempts to free himself. Out of the corner of his eye, he spied a sharp rock wedged against a rock wall at his back. It was only a meter or two to the left. It could have been 100 miles away. His breath rasped short again, bits of froth coming from his mouth as his body struggled to breathe. His blood hammered painfully at his temples. Trying one last time, he pushed all his weight forward, black spots the size of his hand growing over his vision. With all his might, he rocked himself back and pulled at a sharp angle, hoping to drag the beast to the left with him. A blazing hiss of fangs dropped burning liquid on his face. He would have screamed, but there was no air. There was a sudden lurch and a feeling of puncturing behind him. The inhuman sound that erupted from the serpent was hideous and deafening. With a mad slithering, like the tiny legs of 1,000 millipedes, it raced across his body and disappeared into a dark hole in the bottom of the crevasse. Sweet air filled Yassim's lungs, and his body spasmed from shock. His muscles constricted painfully, but he forced his arms to work, tearing the flesh of his hands anew in the process, and pulled himself away from the accursed spot.